Diane sat at the far end of her father's study, the faint smell of old books and leather chairs hanging in the air. She had grown up in this room, watching her father pore over balance sheets and contracts, listening to his careful explanations of how trust was the bedrock of business. Yet now, the room no longer carried the air of dignity it once had. The walls, though lined with trophies and framed certificates, seemed to echo only with silence and defeat. Her father, Mr. Maxwell Grayson, had been a towering figure in the corporate world, commanding respect and admiration for decades. His company, Grayson Industries, had been one of the most stable names in finance until it crumbled under the weight of a scandal so vicious that not even his spotless reputation could withstand. Competitors circled like vultures, journalists spun their cruel stories, and his so-called allies melted away when the storm hit. Diane remembered that night vividly. She had returned home from graduate school, excited to share her acceptance letter for a fellowship abroad, only to find her father slumped in his chair, his once proud shoulders drooping as though the very life had been pulled out of him. The scandal had broken him. "Who did this, Papa?" she had asked then, her voice sharp with both fear and anger. Her father's reply had been little more than a whisper, but she caught the name. A rival, hidden in the shadows, who had betrayed him during a critical merger. The man's identity was unclear, shrouded in documents and deceit, but her father was certain it was no accident. Someone had orchestrated his fall. And from that night onward, Diane carried her father's burden as her own. She swore that she would find the man responsible, no matter how long it took. She would not rest until she dragged him into the open and forced him to taste the same bitterness he had fed her father. Her love for her father was not blind devotion. It was forged from years of respect, admiration, and the knowledge that he had built his empire with sweat and integrity. She would not let treachery destroy his legacy unavenged. But fate has a way of weaving ironies too sharp to see until it is too late. The first time she met George, it was nothing close to extraordinary. It was at a charity gala, one of those evenings where lights sparkled brighter than the stars and laughter masked hidden agendas. Diane had not wanted to attend, but her best friend insisted. She wore a simple emerald dress, her hair pulled back, her mood heavy with the unshakable mission that consumed her thoughts. He had noticed her across the hall. George entered the scene not with boastful strides, but with quiet confidence, dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed molded for him. There was a gentleness in his gaze, a warmth in his smile that disarmed her. Unlike the polished men who approached with rehearsed compliments, George spoke to her as though he had known her for years. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere but here," he said with a grin, his tone soft, not prying but observant. Caught off guard, Diane let out a small laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who feels the same," George replied, lifting his glass slightly as though in a private toast to their shared weariness. That simple exchange marked the beginning of something Diane had never expected. Their conversations grew longer that evening, flowing past polite introductions into deeper territories of books, travels, and dreams. By the time the gala ended, she had forgotten, if only for a moment, the vow she carried in her heart. For months that followed, George became a constant presence in her life. He was attentive, thoughtful, a man who listened more than he spoke. He carried himself with quiet authority but never arrogance, a balance that fascinated her. He had the kind of smile that erased the heaviness she carried, and for the first time in years, Diane allowed herself to feel something close to happiness. Her father noticed the change. "There's a light in your eyes again, my dear," he once remarked. But Diane, torn between her devotion to him and the blossoming affection she could not deny, never shared George's name. Some instinct told her to keep him apart from her father's world. And so, without realizing it, she was falling deeper into the arms of the very man whose name she should have sought first. The man who had once stood in the shadows, unseen yet destructive. His name was George Albright. But to Diane, he was simply George, the man who made her forget, for a while, the taste of vengeance. The rain had just begun to fall when Diane stepped out of the cafe. She paused beneath the awning, unwilling to soak her carefully pressed dress. Her eyes scanned the street in mild frustration until George's car pulled to a stop in front of her. The familiar warmth of his smile met her before his voice did. "Need a ride, or shall I watch you brave the storm like a heroine?" Diane laughed and slid into the passenger seat, shaking her head at his teasing tone. With George, laughter came easily, like a forgotten language she had once spoken fluently but abandoned after her father's downfall. He had a way of softening the edges of her guarded heart, though she never said this aloud. As the wipers swept across the windshield, George glanced at her. "You always seem so elsewhere. Even when you're smiling, part of you is somewhere else. Where does your mind wander, Diane?" She looked out at the rain-smeared city and hesitated. The weight of her father's collapse pressed on her chest, but she could not bring herself to share it. Not yet. "Just life," she answered lightly. "Responsibilities, plans, you know how it is." George didn't press her. That was something she admired. He never forced confessions or crowded her silence. Instead, he offered her a world where laughter, not sorrow, guided the hours. Weeks turned into months, and what began as casual meetings grew into something steadier, something that anchored her days. George brought flowers without reason. He took her to quiet restaurants where conversations lingered long after dessert. He knew how to balance the weight of serious discussions with the ease of playful banter. One evening, as they walked through the park under a canopy of fading autumn leaves, George stopped suddenly. He turned to her, his expression earnest in a way she hadn't seen before. "Diane, do you ever feel like meeting someone was, not chance, but something closer to fate?" The question caught her unprepared. Fate had always been cruel in her eyes. It had stolen her father's company, fractured his spirit, and placed vengeance on her shoulders. Yet here she was, standing before a man who made her wonder if perhaps fate had something else in store for her. "I don't know," she whispered. "I try not to think about fate, it feels too big." George reached for her hand, the coolness of his palm warming quickly against hers. "Maybe it isn't big. Maybe it's just two people finding each other at the right time." She should have pulled away. She should have remembered the vow she had made in her father's study, the promise to find the faceless enemy. Instead, she let herself melt into the moment. For the first time in years, Diane allowed herself to believe in something softer than vengeance. Her father, however, remained a constant voice in her mind. Every Sunday evening she sat with him, playing chess or reading silently in the study. Though he never asked about her personal life, she knew he still bore the invisible scars of betrayal. His health was fragile, his hair whiter, his eyes dimmer. Each time she looked at him, the fire of her promise rekindled. But her heart was beginning to betray her resolve. George proposed a year later. The evening was bathed in candlelight, the ring nestled in a small velvet box. His words were tender, unpretentious, stripped of any grand speech. "I can't imagine my life without you, Diane. Will you marry me?" Her hands trembled, her throat tightened, and for one fragile moment she hesitated. Not because she didn't love him, but because she feared the secrets she kept, the mission that still pulsed in her veins. Yet when she looked into his eyes, steady and sincere, her heart spoke louder than her doubts. "Yes," she whispered, and with that single word she sealed her own fate. The wedding followed months later, a modest yet elegant ceremony. Her father, though frail, walked her down the aisle with pride, masking the pain of his losses with a father's joy. Diane stood beside George at the altar, radiant in her gown, unaware that she was vowing her life to the very man she had sworn to destroy. And so love triumphed, or seemed to. For a year, Diane lived as a wife, her vengeance buried under layers of affection and comfort. She laughed again. She dreamed again. The darkness that had followed her family's collapse felt distant, almost unreal. But truth has a way of waiting patiently, sharpening itself like a knife. It was after their first anniversary that Diane stumbled upon the first crack in the polished surface of her new life. The morning light spilled across the polished floor of George's study, catching on the edge of a silver-framed photograph. Diane had come in search of a book, but her eyes lingered instead on the desk, cluttered in a way she was unaccustomed to seeing. George was meticulous, his papers always arranged, his pens aligned, his space spotless. Today, however, a folder lay open, pages fanned across the surface as though abandoned in haste. She hesitated, the air in the room unnaturally still. Curiosity was a dangerous thing, she told herself, but something in her chest tightened, urging her forward. Diane's fingers brushed lightly against the top sheet, and her eyes caught a name printed in bold across the page. Grayson Industries. Her breath hitched. The page was a legal document, older but unmistakable. It bore references to contracts, mergers, and a trail of corporate exchanges that she half recognized from her father's late-night explanations. Her pulse quickened as she traced the lines, though most of the jargon blurred in her anxious haze. The only clarity came from the signature scrawled at the bottom. George Albright. She dropped the paper as though it burned her. The room seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, the silence heavier. Questions raced through her mind, colliding violently. Why would George's name appear on documents connected to her father's downfall? Why had she never thought to ask more about his past, his business, his rise to success? Her stomach churned. She closed the folder, shoved the papers into place, and forced her breathing steady just as George's footsteps echoed in the hallway. Diane, his voice was casual, unaware of the storm clawing inside her. He appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie, his expression softening when he saw her. "I thought I'd find you in here, looking for one of my books again." She smiled too quickly, her throat dry. "Yes, just a novel, couldn't find it." He stepped closer, brushing his hand lightly against her arm before retrieving a hardcover from the shelf. "Here, I think this is the one you like." Diane accepted the book with a nod, though she hardly registered the title. She could feel his gaze linger, probing gently, but George said nothing more. He kissed her forehead, then moved to the living room as though nothing were amiss. But for Diane, everything had shifted. That night, lying awake beside her husband, she stared at the ceiling, the weight of discovery pressing into her chest. Doubt gnawed at her like a slow poison. Could it be coincidence? Perhaps George had been connected distantly, a name on a paper, nothing more. Yet the certainty in her father's voice echoed back from years ago. Someone orchestrated it. Someone pulled the strings. The thought unsettled her so deeply that she began to observe George differently. His late-night phone calls, once dismissed, now sounded suspicious. His careful avoidance of certain topics felt deliberate. His silences grew louder in her ears. She began to watch him with new eyes. At dinner with friends, she noticed the subtle respect people gave him, the way his name carried weight in conversations about corporate power. She realized, with a shiver, how little she truly knew of his empire, how quickly she had accepted the life he presented without digging deeper. Her father's words echoed again, bitter and sharp. Trust can be the sharpest blade when placed in the wrong hand. One afternoon, she returned to her father's study, where the air always smelled faintly of old paper and loss. She watched him, hunched over a chessboard, moving pieces with slow, trembling fingers. "Papa," she asked softly, If you had the chance to face the man who destroyed you, what would you do? Her father looked up, his eyes tired but steady. I would look him in the eye, and I would never forgive him. The finality in his voice struck Diane like a hammer. She swallowed hard, her pulse thundering. If George was truly the man she feared, then love and vengeance were on a collision course she could no longer avoid. The days that followed brought no peace. Diane moved through the house as though she carried a secret weight pressed against her chest. Outwardly, nothing had changed. She smiled at George, shared meals with him, listened to his plans for upcoming ventures. Yet beneath the surface, her heart trembled with unease. She began to study him quietly, not as a wife studies her husband, but as a seeker studies a stranger. Each gesture, each word, each glance became a puzzle piece she tried to fit into the picture forming in her mind. One evening, as George spoke on the phone in his study, Diane lingered in the hallway, careful not to make a sound. His voice was low, measured, but the words were sharp enough to pierce her. No, the merger was necessary. Grusson never stood a chance. That's business. Sentiment weakens the hand. Her heart pounded in her ears. She pressed her back to the wall, clutching the railing as though it could hold her steady. The name, Grusson, her name, her father's name, it was not coincidence. It was truth breaking through the cracks. She returned to her room before George ended the call, her face pale in the mirror. A storm brewed within her, a conflict no vow could silence. That weekend, she visited her father. The old man looked frailer, his once broad shoulders slumping beneath a cardigan that hung loose on his frame. Yet when he looked at her, his eyes still carried a quiet strength. "You seem troubled," he observed as she poured tea. Diane forced a smile, though her hands trembled. "Just unsettled, Papa. I've been thinking about what you told me years ago, about the man who destroyed you." Mr. Grusson's face darkened. He set his cup down carefully, his hands tightening into fists. "Yes, that man cost me everything. Our family's name, our stability, my health. If I could see him again," his jaw clenched, "I would strip him of the very piece he stole from me." Her throat tightened. "What if," she stopped, her voice faltering. "What if what, Diane?" She looked down at her hands, the tea rippling in its cup. "What if that man was close? What if he was someone you never expected?" Her father studied her in silence, his brow furrowing. "Then, my dear, you must remember where your loyalty lies. Blood does not betray blood. Never forget that." His words lodged deep in her heart like shards of glass. That night, lying beside George, she turned away from him, staring into the dark. He reached out, draping his arm across her waist, a tender gesture that once would have comforted her. Now it burned. She wondered how one man could be both her greatest love and her father's greatest enemy. Her sleep was restless, filled with dreams where George's face blurred into shadows, where her father's voice echoed accusations she could not silence. When morning came, Diane knew she could no longer live between two worlds. She had to know the truth completely. The next day, while George was away on business, she returned to his study. She opened the drawer she had avoided, her fingers trembling. Inside lay a collection of documents, contracts, and reports that painted the history of George's empire. Names leapt from the pages, companies absorbed, rivals destroyed. And there it was. Grusson Industries listed not as a failed merger but as a targeted acquisition. George's signature marked the final approval. The papers told the story plainly. Her father's ruin had not been accident. It had been orchestrated, deliberate, ruthless. Diane's vision blurred with tears as the full weight of truth crushed her chest. She dropped the papers back into the drawer and shut it with trembling hands. The man she had vowed to bring down was the same man she had promised to love until death. Now, Diane stood at the edge of a precipice, torn between two vows that could not coexist. Diane sat in the quiet of her bedroom, the curtains drawn, the afternoon sun reduced to a dim shadow through the fabric. The papers she had discovered in George's study still haunted her vision, their words etched into her memory with cruel precision. Targeted acquisition. Approval signature, George Ulbrett. Her chest ached with a grief she could not name. It was more than betrayal. It was the collapse of the very ground beneath her feet. She had built her life with him, poured her love into his hands, trusted him with the most fragile corners of her heart. And yet, behind that steady smile and tender gaze lay the architect of her father's ruin. How could she reconcile the man who kissed her forehead each morning with the one who had stripped her father of dignity and peace? Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she rose and moved to the mirror, staring at her own reflection. The woman looking back at her no longer seemed whole. There was a fracture running through her, splitting her into two. Diane the wife, Diane the daughter. That evening, George returned from his trip, tired but eager to see her. He swept her into his arms, pressing a kiss against her hair. "I missed you," he murmured, his voice carrying the same warmth that had once melted her resolve. She stiffened, though she forced a smile. "I missed you too." But he noticed. He always noticed. His eyes lingered on her face, searching. "You've been distant lately. Is something wrong?" Diane shook her head quickly, too quickly. "No, I'm fine, just tired. Work, family, you know." George reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "You can tell me anything, Diane. You know that, right?" Her throat tightened. For a fleeting second, she wanted to scream the truth, to hurl the documents in his face, to demand answers, to ask how he could have destroyed her father and still sleep at night. But the words froze, because if she spoke, everything would shatter. Instead, she pulled away softly. "I know, George, I know." Later that night, as he slept beside her, she sat awake, her eyes tracing the lines of his face in the moonlight. How could such a face hide such cruelty? And yet, she loved him. Against every vow of vengeance she had once carried, her heart still loved him. That, perhaps, was the deepest betrayal of all. The following day, she returned to her father. He looked weaker than before, his frame almost swallowed by the armchair. They played chess in silence for a while, the board a battlefield between them. "Papa," she asked suddenly, her voice low, "if someone you loved deeply, someone who had become part of your very soul, turned out to be your enemy, what would you do?" Her father's hand froze above the bishop. Slowly, he set it down. His gaze lifted, steady and grave. "If you love someone who destroys what you hold dear, then love itself becomes a chain. You must choose, Diane. You cannot serve two masters." The words struck her like a judgment. She swallowed, nodding faintly, though her heart rebelled against them. That night, Diane sat alone in her study, a notebook open before her. She wrote her thoughts in trembling lines, questions that had no answers. Could she betray her husband for the sake of her father? Could she betray her father for the sake of her husband? By the time the candle burned low, she knew only one thing for certain. She could no longer remain still. If George was truly the man who had orchestrated her father's downfall, then he owed her the truth. And she would have it, even if it tore her apart. The evening was quiet, broken only by the ticking of the clock in the sitting room. Diane sat across from George at the dinner table, untouched food cooling on her plate. He spoke about a new deal, his voice steady, his hands moving with that familiar calm authority. But Diane heard none of it. Her thoughts raced in circles, her pulse quickening until she could bear it no longer. "George," she interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. He paused mid-sentence, his fork still in hand. His eyes softened as they met hers. "Yes." Her breath trembled as she set down her glass. For weeks, she had rehearsed this moment in her mind, trying to find words that could balance anger with the love that still bound her. Now they tumbled out raw. "Grayson Industries," she whispered. "What do you know about it?" The silence that followed stretched thin, like a wire about to snap. George's face did not change, but his eyes flickered, just once quickly, but enough for Diane to see. He leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "Why do you ask?" Diane's fingers clenched against the tablecloth. "Because it was my father's, because it was destroyed, because every trace I've found points back to you." The words hung heavy between them. George set down his fork with deliberate care, as though handling something fragile. He folded his hands, his gaze steady on her face. "Diane," he exhaled slowly, "I didn't want you to find out this way." Her chest tightened. "So it's true." His silence was answer enough. Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back. "You ruined him. You ruined everything he built. You broke him." George's voice was low, almost pleading. "I did what I had to do. It was business, nothing personal. The market is ruthless, Diane. Your father, he was good, but he was too trusting. If it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else." "Don't you dare excuse it as business." Her voice cracked, raw with grief and fury. "That company was his life. It was our family's legacy. You took it away, and you stand here asking me to accept it as strategy." George rose from his chair, his composure slipping for the first time. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know you then, if I had." "But you did," she cut him off, her hands trembling. "You destroyed my father long before you loved me, and now I am supposed to choose between being his daughter and being your wife." The words broke from her lips before she could stop them, echoing in the tense silence of the room. George's face tightened, pain flickering across his features. He stepped closer, but Diane rose quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Don't," she whispered, stepping back. Her tears fell freely now, her heart tearing with every beat. "I can't look at you and not see what you took from me." George's hand hovered in the air, inches from her arm, before he let it fall. His voice was quiet, almost broken. "Diane, I love you. That hasn't changed. What happened with your father's company, it was survival. But you are everything to me." She shook her head, unable to bear his words. Love and hate, loyalty and betrayal warred within her until she thought she might split apart. Without another word, she left the dining room, her steps unsteady as she climbed the stairs. Behind her, the silence pressed down heavy, broken only by the sound of George's quiet sigh, a sound filled with regret she did not yet know how to trust. That night they lay in the same bed, but a gulf stretched between them wider than oceans. Diane turned away from him, her body rigid, her eyes open to the dark. For the first time since their vows, love had been poisoned. And Diane knew. The battle between her father's blood and her husband's love had only just begun. The air in her father's house was heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, a silence that seemed to press down on every corner. Diane sat across from Mr. Grayson, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had not planned to speak of it so soon, but the words burned inside her until they could not be contained. "Papa," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I know who destroyed Grayson Industries." Her father's eyes sharpened, the weariness lifting for a moment as though her words had struck fire in him. "Who?" Her throat tightened. "George." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Mr. Grayson stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, very slowly, his hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles whitening. "George," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Your husband." Diane's eyes stung. "Yes." For a moment, her father said nothing. Then, with a bitter laugh that sounded more like a growl, he leaned back. The irony of it all. My enemy sits at my table, sleeps under the same roof as my daughter, and you married him." "Papa, I didn't know," Diane whispered, her voice breaking. "I swear I didn't. I only found out after everything, after I gave him my heart." Her father's face hardened, the years of loss etching themselves deeper into his features. "Then you must take it back. You must cut him from your life as he cut us from ours." Diane shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It isn't that simple. I love him. Despite everything, I still love him." Mr. Grayson's gaze pierced her, sharp with fury. "Love? What use is love when he has already stolen everything from us? He is not a man, Diane. He is a vulture. He fed on our ruin, and now he feeds on your devotion. If you stay with him, you betray me. You betray your blood." The words cut deeper than any blade. Diane turned away, her chest heaving with silent sobs. "I am torn, Papa," she whispered. "If I destroy him, I destroy the man I love. If I forgive him, I betray you. How am I to live between two worlds that cannot meet?" Mr. Grayson leaned forward, his voice fierce, trembling with both age and anger. "You are my daughter. You are Grayson blood. You will not choose him over me. Promise me, Diane. Promise me you will not let him walk free after what he has done." Her lips quivered. She wanted to promise to soothe the fire in her father's eyes. Yet another part of her, fragile and aching, longed for George's arms, for the memory of his laughter, for the warmth of their home before truth poisoned it. That night, back in her own house, she found George waiting in the sitting room. He looked up as she entered, his face weary, his eyes shadowed. "You told him," he said quietly. Diane froze. "How do you know?" George gave a faint, pained smile. "I know you. I saw it in your eyes when you left this morning. And I know your father, he will never forgive me." She turned away, unable to meet his gaze. George rose and crossed the room, standing close enough for her to feel the warmth of him. His voice softened. "Diane, I cannot change the past, but I would undo it if I could, for you. Everything I built, everything I fought for, means nothing if I lose you." Her heart twisted, torn in half. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love could rewrite history. But her father's words rang in her ears. "If you stay with him, you betray me." For the first time, Diane realized she might lose one of them forever. And whichever choice she made would leave her broken. Diane's nights had become sleepless. She wandered the halls of the house while George slept, her bare feet cold against the marble floor, her mind burning with her father's voice. "You will not choose him over me." The documents she had found still lay hidden in a drawer of her own, copies she had quietly made. Each page felt like a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. Her father had urged her to act, to bring them into the open, to drag George's empire through the same humiliation that Grayson Industries had suffered. And yet, every time she held the papers in her hands, her chest ached with hesitation. Could she truly destroy the man who had given her love, laughter, and a life she never thought she'd know again? One evening, she sat at her desk, staring at the documents until her vision blurred. Her hand hovered above the phone, ready to call a journalist her father trusted. Just one call, and George's carefully built world could come crashing down. But her hand froze. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered into the empty room, "Why did it have to be you, George?" Downstairs, George stood by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring into the night. He had not slept well either. Diane's distance was no longer subtle. It was a chasm widening between them. Every silence cut deeper than any argument. He thought of telling her everything, every reason, every detail of the ruthless climb that had led him to destroy Grayson Industries. But what would explanations change? Ruthlessness was not softened by confession. He feared that if he spoke, she would only hate him more. Yet the silence was worse. When Diane entered the room, he turned quickly, setting his glass aside. "We can't go on like this," he said. His voice was low but edged with desperation. "You barely look at me. You barely speak. I feel like I'm losing you by the hour." Diane's heart twisted. She wanted to reach for him to ease the pain in his eyes, but the thought of her father's face, lined with sorrow and betrayal, held her back. "Maybe you are losing me," she said quietly. The words struck George harder than any blow. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "So that's it. Everything we've built, everything we've been through, you'll throw it away because of a past I cannot change." Diane's voice rose, trembling. "That past destroyed my father, it broke him, and now you ask me to live as though it never happened. How can I, George? How can I love you and not betray the man who raised me?" George's chest heaved. For a moment, anger flickered in his eyes, but it softened quickly into pain. "I never asked for your forgiveness for what I did to your father. I only ask you to see me as the man I am with you, not the man I was." But Diane shook her head, her tears finally spilling. "You can't separate them. They are the same man, and I am torn in half because of it." They stood in silence, the space between them filled with the echo of everything unsaid. That night, Diane returned to her desk. She picked up the documents once more, staring at them until dawn's first light crept into the room. Her heart knew she was standing on the edge of an irreversible choice. She could be her father's daughter, or she could be George's wife. But she could not be both. Rain drummed against the windows as Diane sat alone in the study. The documents lay spread before her, accusing her with every page. Her father's voice echoed in her head like a haunting refrain. "You will not choose him over me." Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, pausing over the name of the journalist her father had once mentioned. She pressed the number with a shaking finger, then froze. Her chest tightened. What if she destroyed George and afterward realized she still loved him? What if she condemned them both to misery when there might have been a way forward? The phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the desk. Diane buried her face in her palms, torn between duty and devotion, vengeance and love. At that very moment, fate moved faster than her hesitation. The door to the study creaked open. George stood there, pale and drawn, his eyes falling instantly on the documents strewn across the desk. For a breath, silence, then his gaze lifted to her face. "You have them," he said, his voice low, hollow. Diane's heart lurched. She rose quickly, fumbling for words. "George, it's not what you think, But he was already striding forward, snatching the papers from the desk. He scanned them, his face tightening with every line. "Copies, you made copies." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't send them anywhere. I couldn't. I didn't know what to do." George's hand slammed against the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "You hesitated. That's all that saved me. One more moment of courage and you would have destroyed me." Her voice broke. "I was trying to choose, George, between you and my father, between love and blood. I didn't want to hurt you." His eyes, usually warm, were dark with hurt and disbelief. "But you thought about it. You laid the blade against my throat and only stopped yourself from pressing down. Do you have any idea what that does to me?" Diane stepped forward, reaching for him. "Please, listen." But George pulled back, his jaw tight. "I trusted you with everything I am, and you—" His voice cracked, his anger faltering into despair. "You don't even know which side you're on." The rain outside grew heavier, thunder rolling in the distance. Diane felt her chest collapse under the weight of her own indecision. She had not betrayed him outright, yet in her hesitation, she had betrayed him all the same. She saw it in his eyes, how the doubt had settled, how the wound had cut deeper than any exposure to the world could have. When George finally spoke, his voice was quiet, broken. "If you cannot choose me fully, then you've already chosen against me." And with that, he turned and walked out of the study, leaving Diane trembling, her knees weakening beneath her. She sank into the chair, clutching the documents to her chest, her sobs drowned by the storm outside. For the first time, she understood. Her greatest mistake had not been choosing her father or her husband. It had been waiting too long to decide. The days after the storm were marked by silence. George no longer lingered at the breakfast table. He left the house before dawn, returned after midnight, and when he spoke, it was only in fragments, practical words with no warmth. The bare necessities of a household, still bound by marriage, but hollowed by mistrust. Diane felt the absence more sharply than his presence. The man who had once laughed with her in the garden, who had whispered dreams into her ear, now walked like a shadow. And she, burdened with both guilt and longing, did not know how to bridge the void she had created. Her father visited one evening, his health failing but his eyes bright with a cruel satisfaction when he saw George's absence from the house. "You've finally seen the man for who he is," Mr. Grayson said. "Good, now finish what you started. Use what you have and bring him down. It will heal me before I go." But Diane's heart recoiled. She looked at her father's lined face and felt both love and pity, yet also a strange clarity. Destroying George would not heal her father. Nothing could. The past was gone, and vengeance could not breathe life into it again. And still, she could not say she would spare George. Her silence once more was her curse. That night, George confronted her in their bedroom. He stood by the door, his expression weary, his voice stripped of all tenderness. "I can't live like this," he said. "Every glance, every silence feels like judgment. I don't know if you see me as your husband or your enemy, and the truth is, I don't think you know either." Diane's lips trembled. "George, I love you, I always have." "But you love your father's vengeance too," he replied quietly. "And love divided is no love at all." Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped closer. "Please, give me time. I can choose you. I want to." But George shook his head. "Time is what broke us, Diane. You hesitated, and in that space, everything changed. I can forgive your father's hatred, but not your doubt, not when it cuts me every day." He kissed her forehead, one last tender gesture, and pulled away. He gathered his things quietly, without anger, without a raised voice. The finality of his calmness was worse than rage. At dawn, Diane stood at the window, watching as George's car rolled down the drive and disappeared into the horizon. She pressed her palm to the cold glass, her sobs silent, her heart hollow. Her father's triumph was meaningless. Her marriage was ashes, and she, caught between the two, had lost them both. In the end, Diane learned that hesitation can wound more deeply than choice. And in the silence of her empty home, she carried the weight of that lesson alone.